Hello, my name is Penny Lane. It is my real name. Hackers don't wear hoodies. The days of the lone genius teenager hacking out of his parents' basement are long gone. Today's cyber criminals are incredibly well organized and have sophisticated attack tools at their disposal. In order to counter these attacks, we at Visa are constantly utilizing new and innovative approaches. We've put together a short video that illustrates what we are up against and how we are fighting back. And cue the video. So I feel like I should come out of the ceiling after that, but I'm just... So as the video described, we are all facing continuous challenges from cyber criminals. Some examples of very common attacks that we see in the payments industry, they include things called ATM Cashouts, what I call wire transfer fraud, what I think that you would call fraud targeting TED. These are the ways that threat actors or bad actors monetize privileged access at banks and financial institutions. This is how they make money. We also see what we call business logic errors, when organized criminals identify very obscure misconfigurations in transaction processing and force an approval of a payment that should have been a decline. We also see merchant breaches, whether they're targeting card-present point-of-sale terminals or online e-commerce websites. In order to deter these attacks, we combine intelligence, awareness, and disruption. The goal is to come at these criminals from every possible angle, keeping them guessing about how we're going to detect their activities and forcing them to make mistakes. For the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to start with an overview of bad actor motivations and explain why it's important to understand that. And then I'm going to walk through two real-world hacks that were reported in the media that illustrate the tactics and techniques that we commonly see in the payments environment. And then I'll close with a high-level overview of how Visa is uniquely addressing these type of crimes. Oh, I forgot my title, Hackers Don't Wear Hoodies. Everything in this briefing is for informational purposes only. Any of my recommendations have to be taken in light of your own personal needs or your organization's needs. In order to successfully deter cyber criminals, it's very important to understand both their motivation as well as their skill level. Because when you know this, then you can better allocate your own resources to counter what they're doing. There are generally three types of attack groups. Oops. The first is organized cybercrime. These bad actors work together with a goal of making money as quickly and easily as possible. They're basically a business, but an illegal business. So They want to look at the bottom line and see how much money they can make as quickly as possible without getting caught, obviously. Traditionally, they're known for creating custom malware that targets card-present point-of-sale terminals. More recently, they've expanded their operations to target online merchant websites, as well as direct attacks against financial institutions and banks. As their name implies, this group is very well organized. They have a lot of resources at their disposal, and they have very sophisticated tactics and techniques that they use. The next groups is hacktivists. These are kind of the wild card, because you never know exactly what they're going to do next. These are loosely organized collectives of like-minded individuals who are seeking to promote the same agenda. It may be religious, political, or social in nature. They're typically not very well organized, and their tools are pretty basic, but it would be a big mistake to discount the damage they can do. So for instance, if they're able to launch a distributed denial of service attack that takes down your e-commerce server, your company could lose a lot of money. Or if they target your internal email server and dump out all your internal messages on the internet for anyone to see, they could be taken out of context, and your company could suffer a lot of brand damage. And lastly, nation state. These are government-sponsored operatives who carry out very targeted attacks with the goal of... Oh, did I not go forward? Thank you so much. These are government-sponsored operatives who carry out very targeted attacks, and their goal is to steal and destroy sensitive data and communications. These organizations are by far the most difficult to detect in your networks, and even once you detect them, it's really difficult to completely eradicate them because they have many footholds. If you remember, a couple years ago in the United States, the Office of Personnel Management was breached that holds classified records and fingerprints for all government employees, including my own. It was breached, but it took them 343 days to discover they'd been hacked. Just pretty impressive, 343 days. For the purpose of the talk today, I'm focusing on organized cybercrime, groups whose goal is to make money as quickly and easily as possible. So before I go into some details about examples of hacks against banks, I want to give a little bit more background on wire transfer or fraud using TED or SWIFT is what is more commonly seen, and ATM Cashout fraud. So we see organized crime groups attacking banks. Why do they go after banks? Banks have money. But it's not easy to hack into a bank. You need a lot of people, you need a lot of tools. When you get into the bank, if you come in digitally, you obviously can't steal the physical money, so you have to figure out a way to monetize that privileged access without getting caught, and so that usually requires that you set up a fraud event. And that can take weeks. It typically takes about 8 weeks minimum for a fraud event to be set up. Once a bank is hacked, and this is done lots of different ways, but most commonly through phishing emails, attackers will move laterally through the network and try to identify the best fraud case that they could leverage to monetize that access. So for instance, if they are able to get control of the server that does transfers of banks, of money between banks, they might go after that. And that's what we call, what I call wire transfer fraud. Or if they're able to get in front of the ATM, to change withdrawal limits on ATMs, they might go that route. Or sometimes, and I've seen this, they'll do both. They'll attack a bank with an ATM Cashout, and then while they're recovering from that and they're in disarray, they'll hit them again while they're down with a wire transfer fraud. We see these attacks all over the world. No region is exempt from them. Typically, the attackers will go after the smaller banks. Not always, but usually, and that's because they usually don't have as many security defenses, and they typically don't have staff monitoring their networks 24/7. So they feel it's more likely they'll get away with some sort of attack. What's important to notice here is what I said about after the bank is hacked, it takes 6 to 8 weeks usually before the fraud occurs. So that gives the bank a window to identify that they've been hacked and to eradicate any malware that's been placed on their systems before it becomes a fraud event and they lose millions of dollars. My team in particular watches for this type of activity occurring. And if we do notice it, because we can see when certain malware families are communicating out to malicious servers on the internet, and we trace it back. If it traces back to one of our clients, we'll do outreach and help them remediate and fix the problem so they don't have to worry about this type of fraud. So now I wanted to start out with, to me, one of the most interesting hacks that have happened in the recent history. It's actually the most financially damaging that I know of in the payments industry in history. And it's commonly called the Bangladesh bank heist. Has anyone ever heard of the Bangladesh bank heist? Yeah? Oh, that's good. So what happened, it's an old, sort of old, 3 years ago, but I still see these technique used all the time. So what happened was in the summer of 2015, fall of 2015, attackers were able to hack the Bank of Bangladesh. And when they got in there, they do what we always see. They moved laterally to see, what type of fraud they could leverage. And they were able to get access to the server that controlled wire transfers, transfers of money between banks. Once they had this access, they planned the fraud event. Another good thing about hacking smaller banks, though Bank of Bangladesh wasn't very small, but you would think, oh, if I hack a bigger bank, I can get more money. It's not true. You can hack a small bank and still get a whole lot of money because it's all digital, right? And if you can change thresholds, it doesn't matter. So, why go after the big banks if the smaller ones are easier? So they planned this very extensive fraud campaign, and they launched it on Thursday evening, February 4th, 2016. The fact that they launched it on a Thursday night is significant because in Bangladesh is a Muslim country. Their weekend is Friday and Saturday. So by launching the fraud attack on Thursday evening, all the employees had already left for the day, and there was probably minimal monitoring of these transfers of money. So, and on that evening, bad guys that had hacked into the systems, and I think this is a different team. I think you have one team of people that does the actual hack and set it up, and another team that carries out the fraud. So these people sent out 35 transfer orders totaling $951 million US. That's a lot of money. So if they had been successful in this, it would have been devastating to the country of Bangladesh. Interestingly, all 35 orders were initially declined. And this is where I think the crew that did this messed up. Because the reason they were declined, the first crew spent months planning this attack, setting everything up. The second crew came in to carry out the fraud, and they forgot to fill in a required field in the in the transfer of funds. It's pretty stupid, right? But they figured out what they did, and they quickly fixed it, and they resubmitted the 35 orders. When they did this, 30 of the 35 were blocked, and this was just luck. Okay, this is kind of cool. In the transfer orders and the address, they had the word Jupiter, I believe it was Jupiter Street. By coincidence, the U.S. government had, at that time, sanctions against the country of Iran, and specifically against an Iranian shipping company called Jupiter. So in the accounts held in the Federal Reserve in the United States on behalf of the Bank of Bangladesh, there was software searching for the word Jupiter on any money transfer requests. These hit and were automatically flagged and declined. Otherwise, this would have been much bigger breach. But if you're still following me, there are 5 transactions totaling 101 million US dollars that were approved by the Federal Reserve and sent on. Of those 5, one went to a bank in Sri Lanka called Pan Asia Bank for $20 million, and it was going to a nonprofit charity. The bank in Sri Lanka asked their colleagues at Deutsche Bank to review the activity, and a smart person there noticed that the word foundation was incorrectly spelled as fandation. They spelled it wrong. Another bad mistake by the crew that was doing the fraud. So that was rejected as well. You may have read about that in the papers as the $20 million spelling error. So it's also kind of funny. So now we're down to 4 wire transfers, $81 million. Those went to Rizal Commercial Banking Corp, or RCBC in the Philippines, $81 million. So while this was going on, did I mess it up? What happened to my beautiful slide? Thank you. You're my partner. Thank you. So 4 orders went to RCBC in the Philippines. So at least I was thinking, well, what the heck are they doing back here at Bank of Bangladesh, right? So what they did remember Friday and Saturday is the weekend, but they still had 2 people go in on Friday, which is the first weekend day, to the top floor of the building into the locked printer server room that printed out a copy of all the previous day's money transfers. And so when the 2 people went in on Friday and went to the printer to review the activity, there was no printout. And I'm not quite sure if it was the malware, the custom malware that was deployed that stopped the printing, or if it truly was broken. But they did what any good employee would do. They filled out a work order to have it fixed. And it wasn't fixed until Sunday, which was the beginning of their work week. So on Sunday, everyone came back into the office, and they got the prints from the previous day's transfers and saw this whopping request for $951 million. They immediately tried to call the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. And you might be able to guess what happened. It was Sunday. Sunday in the United States is a weekend, and at the time the Federal Reserve did not have any 24/7 call center, so they couldn't get hold of anyone. They also tried to send a message to the transfer protocol network, it's SWIFT network, telling them to suspend the transfers, but the hackers had actually written custom malware that deleted those requests. So they weren't able to contact anybody at the Federal Reserve. In frustration, then, they followed the transfers and saw that 4 went to RCBC in the Philippines. They attempted to call the Philippines on Monday. As luck would have it, and I don't think this was luck, Monday was a holiday in the Philippines. It's Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year. It's perfectly planned. The timing of this attack was beautiful, right? So they couldn't get hold of anybody at RCBC, and so they sent them an email asking, left voice messages and sent them emails saying, please, please stop these transactions. At RCBC in the Philippines, they come to work Tuesday morning all ready to roll, and they've got this backup of, money transfers. And they process those first. And they say that, the email messages from Bank of Bangladesh did not have a high priority, so they just looked at those later, and it was the afternoon by the time they saw them, and by that time, the money had already been placed into accounts, individual accounts, that had been set up the previous August and never used at RCBC. Let me see. So when they tracked those 4 accounts, as soon as the money went into them, it was withdrawn, and it was deposited and used in the casinos in the Philippines. So here again, you might think, aha, we can track where this money went because it went through casinos. The year earlier, the Philippine government wanted to attract more tourism to the country. And so they exempted casinos from their anti-money laundering rules. So they didn't have good documentation about where the money went once it hit the casinos. The best we could do after that is it went to Hong Kong. There are lots of theories about where it went after that. 18 million was recovered, but 63 million was not. So these attackers got away with $63 million. And but for a few mistakes, they could have been close to $1 billion US. So a lot of lessons to be learned here about having off-hours contact information, practicing disaster recovery methodology, watching your networks, things like that. But it's a very, very interesting attack. Now I want to switch it up a little bit and talk about ATM Cashouts. This is another way that hackers monetize their access once they've gotten into a bank system. And this is what I call the traditional way, because this is what we would see up until about a year ago. So there's a picture of the bad guy. And those computers represent workers at the bank. So they send in phishing emails to the workers at the bank, and it's easy enough to get their email addresses out of social media. Sooner or later, if you send enough phishing emails, someone's going to click it. There's no doubt. So if you're responsible for networks, my advice would be assume a phishing email is going to get through. Then what are you going to do? Have you patched your systems? Most of the vulnerabilities that these phishing emails take advantage of were patched years ago, but nobody's, have you segregated your network so that you can't easily move from where your employees work to the actual transaction area, processing area of your network? Anyway, so they get into the system. Once they get in, they move laterally, as I said before, and they're looking, in this case, for the person at the bank who has the ability to set how much money you can withdraw from an ATM. So if you could normally withdraw $200, they might make it no limit or make it $5,000. So they would find that person. Since they've got privileged access, it's really probably not too hard to up it and take over that account. They would unlock it, and for certain account numbers that map to the bank, they would raise the thresholds. And then this is where the organization part comes in. Now they have to have people that actually take the money out of ATMs. You don't necessarily want to have, so if I hack into Bank X, I don't want to take the money out of Bank X's ATMs. You want to take it out of a different bank's ATMs, because the more different groups that the hackers can get involved in these attacks, the less likely it is that the good guys will cooperate, right? And it makes everything harder. Typically, when we call this cash out crews or mules, they'll be stationed in other countries. So if the bank that's hacked is in Brazil, the mules will be in US, Vietnam, everywhere. I've seen attacks with mules in over 200 countries at the same time. So they place these people all over the world. They give them counterfeit mag-stripe cards that map to the accounts whose limits were raised. And at a certain date, at a certain time, they tell them, go. And they take out money as quickly as we can. And then it's a race between my teams and their team, right? This takes a lot of organization. And then the money's gone. And because they're taking out money between countries, you've got laws, right? You've got, sharing information between countries. You've got cultural differences. You've got language differences, time zone differences. These withdrawals mostly always happen on evenings, weekends, and holidays. And they take advantage of that. More recently, we've seen more sophisticated operations. It's called in some of the news reports as fast cash. There are other names for it. Some of you, if you're real techie gearheads, I'm sure you'll be aware of this one. Fast cash starts the same way, with a phishing email. One modification they might do, if you're like me and you have a big head and you think, oh, no one can get a phishing email past me. What they do is they identify vendors of the bank or organizations that work with the bank on a regular basis that probably have no or little security. They hack them. And then they find like an invoice that's routinely sent to the bank or a report. And they mimic that report and they send it from a compromised account at a vendor of the bank. So even if you're really good and you look at headers of emails and you look at the domain names, it can still come by you. And it can still be a malicious link or an attachment. Most recently, we've seen, besides phishing, they've actually stolen people's LinkedIn social media profiles and sent job recruiting advertisements to the banks, asking them to apply for a job. In one case that was in the media recently, they sent a notice to a bunch of developers at a company, and one of the developers applied for the job. He did it from home, and his home computer was then infected. Well, the bad guys wanted to infect the bank, not his home. So the next day, they contacted him and said, we could not read your application. Please do it now. We need it very soon. So he did it again from work, and then their organization was infected. That's how much they persevere once they've targeted an organization. So once they get in, again, they move laterally. But this time, instead of looking for the person responsible for setting limits on withdrawals, they look for the server that's hosting what we call the payment gateway switch. This is the software that decides whether to approve a transaction or decline it. And they set up, once they find that server that hosts this application, they send up their own custom version of the application. And what it does is set up to approve every ATM transaction that is sent after this certain date and time without any kind of authentication. That's typically called a man-in-the-middle attack. So when they do this, when people are at the ATMs taking out money, the account numbers on the counterfeit mag stripe that map back to this bank, they go and they're intercepted by this man-in-the-middle application, and it just approves everything. This is a lot more efficient and for several reasons. One is they don't have to keep very accurate lists of the account numbers that have had thresholds raised, right? All they got to do is have an account number that maps back to that bank. Also, the bank itself, if you call them and say, hey, you just lost $1 million, they'll say, no, we didn't. And because they don't have any logs of it, because it was intercepted and approved before it got to their switch, so they don't see it. And so then you have to, convince them that there is a problem. So this is much more powerful. This type of attack with very organized cash-out crews, we've seen attacks most recently at the rate of $250,000 a minute in withdrawals. $250,000 a minute. So it's imperative that we recognize these quickly and stop them even faster. So here's an example of an ATM Cashout that was successful and reported in the news. Again, this was about 3 years ago, but when I read the description of it, it seems to kind of fit this fast cash kind of tactics and techniques. So this happened on a Sunday morning, May 15th, 2016. 120 people, or mules as we call them, were stationed only in Japan, which is a little different. Typically you see all countries in the world used, but in this attack they were only stationed in Japan. Every person was given an envelope, and the envelope contained a pamphlet with detailed instructions on how the people were supposed to take money out of the ATMs. And it also contained 16 counterfeit mag stripe cards that map back to a previously hacked bank in South Africa. Every person was to take out, they went to convenience stores in Japan, and they were supposed to take out one card, use it 10 times, no more than 10 times, and take out the maximum that those ATMs would allow each time, which when this happened was 100,000 yen, which is about $900 US. So they would use each card 10 times, taking $900 at a time, throw away that card, go to a different ATM or convenience store and do it again until they did all 16 of their cards as quickly as they could. So they launched this attack Sunday morning, 5 a.m. in Japan, which correlated to 8 p.m. Sunday night in South Africa. In the space of 3 to 4 hours, they hit over 1,400 ATMs, and between $18 and $19 million was lost. The rate of withdrawals of this was $80,000 a minute. So this is old school, right? Because now we're seeing 3 times that. Their capabilities have grown. Why did this work? Why was it so successful? The bank for the convenience stores that had the ATMs, that's called the acquirer, they noticed this activity. And they were able to track down the bank in South Africa where the funds were coming from. But you can imagine how difficult it was to go from Japan to South Africa on a weekend with the language and cultural. As a small bank, they didn't have anybody on staff. You have to find out who the CEO is. It's difficult to do. Even when they got hold of the bank refused to believe they were hacked because they saw no logs, right? Which makes me believe it was the man-in-the-middle attack that we saw previously. And I also wonder, why Japan? It works well from a timing perspective, right? Because early morning in Japan on Sunday is late night Saturday, still weekend. So that's kind of good if you want to make sure there aren't staff online detecting this activity. The other thing at the time was that the ATMs in Japan had a relatively high withdrawal rate that they allowed. $900 a pop is pretty good. Later, about 100 people were arrested that were part of the money mule operation. They were thought to be associated with a Japanese mafia called the Yakuza. So another very interesting case. The bad guys made a lot of money. So I want to talk a little bit about how we at Visa are fighting back. And as you can tell, I love my job. I have one of the best teams in the world, some of the most talented people in the world, I think, as well. We have a capability that we don't talk a lot about, but it runs underneath every transaction that's processed through VisaNet, and it's called vital signs. This capability, we watch every ATM withdrawal that happens in the world, every single time you use your account. The whole world. So tremendous processing power behind this. And we detect any unusual activity at the account level and also the bank level. So at the account level, some of it's fairly straightforward. If you take out a lot more money than you usually do, if you're in 2 places at the same time, if you're taking it out too quickly, things like that, we would automatically detect it and suspend the account. At the bank level, we do the same thing. We use some machine learning. We look at normal activity and some not so normal activity. We've got a lot of ways we do it. We detect it, and we shut it down automatically. This saves these banks that have been hacked from losing millions of dollars, but it's not a fun job because I'm the one that has to call the bank and tell them that, they've been hacked. But at least they didn't lose like we saw here, which is a good thing. We also recently enhanced vital signs to not just look at ATM, but to look at card present and card not present internet transactions as well. We're seeing a lot of online fraud, and this will detect those activities as well, and we can automatically shut them down. We have another tool, which is called the Payment Attack Scenario Simulation. So in my old job at Visa, I started our first ethical hacking team, penetration testing. And then I also started what we call red team hacking, where we have people in the organization try to hack into it, pretending we don't know anything about the networks. So when I started working on the risk side at Visa, I didn't see why we couldn't do the same thing. So what we do is we have a test lab that simulates transactions coming over payments networks, and we look at banks, we work with banks, send over transactions, and my team attempts every type of fraud methodology that we can think of. We fuzz, if you're a developer, we fuzz different parameters. We try to get an approval when it should be a decline. So for instance, say a bank doesn't support contactless payments. Some banks, they never expect contactless to come through, and so their rules default to approve, because banks like to approve money. But that can also be the source of a lot of fraud. So we look for things like that, these obscure misconfigurations that organized crime groups are finding, and we try to find them first. And that's been pretty successful as well. E-commerce fraud. When an online merchant is hacked, it's usually quite a cumbersome process to figure out who was hacked. So if you get your credit card statement and it shows transactions that you did not make, you call your bank and they reverse it, right? And then you don't worry about it so much. But if the bank gets a bunch of these, they'll start looking at the history of the transactions and see if, look for what we call a common point of purchase. And if everybody went to the same restaurant that later suffered fraud, then we make a pretty good guess that that restaurant was hacked. Then we send in a forensic investigator. They do all sorts of testing. They find out where the breach happened, and they remediate it. And this is good. It works, but it's slow. And it doesn't work in the year 2019, in my mind. It's too slow. So a very clever man on my team came up with this idea. We're very lucky in that we get to see data from all over the world. Every bank, every merchant. We see all the breach. My team investigates every large payments breach that you've seen in the news. So it's a really interesting, dynamic job. But we keep, in fairly simple terms, we keep a humongous database of all the indicators of compromise associated with these breaches. We keep all the IP addresses that were used maliciously, domain names, social media accounts, anything connected to it. And we map out the networks and the digital infrastructure that's used by organized crime groups again and again. Because if you remember back at the beginning, organized crime groups want to make money with a good profit line, so they reuse these command and control servers. They don't set up a new one for every hack. So many of these are in countries that we can't take down, but we know they're out there. So we monitor communications between these command and control servers and sites all over the world. If we see a malicious command and control server talking to a legitimate merchant website, that should not happen. So then we'll go and we look at that site, and typically there'll be malware injected in the JavaScript on the payment page for that site. So it's pretty easy to scan through that site. We don't need any kind of extra privileges. It's right there, view source. We identify that. We take an image of it and shoot it off to the merchant and to the merchant's bank and help them remediate it. What's cool about this is that we can find a breached merchant site without any fraud reports. We don't have to wait for you to lose money before we can find it and address it. So everything's faster. It's less expensive for the merchants, for their banks. It's a happy world. So this has been wildly successful, which is good and bad. I mean, we find thousands and thousands. We were inundated with these sites that were compromised. So what we're working on this year is automating the entire process, which is pretty interesting. Underneath all this is our payments intelligence capabilities. I've got a team of very good people and that are constantly searching sources for any rumors or evidence of vulnerabilities in systems or planned breaches of systems. We are constantly watching, and we take this information and we turn it into alerting to our clients. If we can, we make it Visa public and available. In just the last 3.5 months, we've discovered 41 banks that were hacked that had not yet had an ATM cash out or money transfer fraud. So we were able to go and do outreach to those banks and help them remediate before they lost a whole bunch of money, which is not something you read about in the news, but that's what makes us most proud, is when we're able to do that. So in summary, I just want to say a few short last things, is that we believe disruption, which I didn't talk about too much. If we put everything that we find into cases and share it with law enforcement and try to get people arrested. But sometimes we can't do that because they're in countries that don't want to cooperate. So we will do legal disruption. So if we see a server constantly hacking other legitimate sites, we will work with a hosting provider of that server, provide evidence that it's being used maliciously. They'll take it down. And the bad guys will stand up a new server, but it's a pain in the butt for them. It costs them time, money. They're using fake names and things that bigger chance of them getting caught. So we try to make their lives as miserable as possible. So I think that the disruption techniques that we apply are a really good example of our philosophy in action. We're going to continue to counter any types of illegal activity from multiple angles, whether it be from awareness to arrest. And finally, we believe that this fast, multifaceted approach, going at these guys from every angle, is key to combating cybercrime. Thank you very much, and I'll be around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions. Thank you.